This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is the London Fintech Podcast, episode 245, brought to you in association with Smart and theunlistedboard.com. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Louis Carbonnier, president and co-founder of French Fintech Hokodo, to talk about Fintech in France. Having super recently, only a couple of episodes ago in LFP245, covered tech in Berlin, I thought it only fair to give their long-time adversaries a chance to talk about Fintech in France. You've probably heard of Fintech by now, and you've probably heard of France. So without further ado, plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Good afternoon, Louis. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
Good afternoon, Mike. Thanks a lot for having me. And nice intro. And as someone who grew up on the German border and whose first language was German, it's been a long time since we were adversaries with Germany, and now today it's more about collaboration.
Well, I thought you were in the EU, which meant that everybody's an adversary in the smoke-filled rooms, even if when they come out in public they say, "Oh, we agree on everything." Europe has always been a bit of a tug of war. So, if you're on the border, were you in Alsace-Lorraine, the bit that kept switching sides, and to this day has Germanic wine bottles, but with what was kind of Franco-German wine? I like Alsace wines.
Yeah, totally. I mean, actually, I was born in Champagne.
I'm not averse to champagne either, actually.
Yeah, well, the English are the biggest importers of champagne globally, but that mainly comes from German traders who set up the big Maison de Champagne in the 19th century. So think Bollinger, Roederer, Krug, those famous and expensive bottles. So, and then I moved to Strasbourg, and hence how I came to grow up between France and Germany. And at some point, I even moved to the German-speaking part of Switzerland. So, it's all a small region where the borders are pretty fungible.
Excellent. Well, if you go back long enough, you were all sort of relatively similar peoples, but that was some time ago. Excellent. So, in terms of kicking things off, you being bicultural and all that, you said you quite like minor matters like sports, music and literature, which I'm sure we can knock that off entirely in about 2 or 3 minutes. But is there much, sticking with this cross-cultural thing, is there much sort of literature, shall we say, from the border regions of France and Germany, which, as it were, Janus-like faces in both directions and has a bit of a feel of the two areas?
That's a really good question, because there's a lot of literature that actually, like if you take the dialect in Alsace, so Alsacish, it's literally a version of German peppered with French words, and there's a lot of, as you said, back and forth over the years, and like figures like Erckmann, Chatrian, who've been like very influenced by the Germanic part of their upbringing. It's even when you look at the psyche of an Alsatian person, there, within France, that's a very centralized country. Even up to today, there's something quite specific in how we look at life. And sometimes I joke to my wife, who's a true Parisian, that when I travel to Karlsruhe or to Heidelberg or to Zurich, it feels much more like home than when I go to Paris or to Marseille, who are like completely different places and organized in a weird sort of way for someone who's grown in a different, mentality.
Yes. I wonder whether you'd feel perhaps even more at home if you're in Switzerland, in the bits where the sort of the French bit and the German and the Swiss Germany bits kind of sort of border on each other, and people kind of speak both and have this bicultural vibe. Because as a foreigner to the continent on this little sort of island northwest, which was connected by the Dogger Bank back in the day, literally, if one was in France or one was in Germany with one's eyes shut and it's almost like your fingers in your ears, there's a different feel today between the areas, although going back to when you were all sort of version of Franks, there was less so. And actually, just interestingly, I do try and watch every video on YouTube of interest, which is taking quite some time, and I think I'm falling behind. I think the list is getting longer.
It takes a lifetime.
Yes, quite, exactly. Well, I'm using it up so far on that, but I did see one that had one of these fascinating thumbnails, and of course it's all in the art of the thumbnail these days to suck somebody into yours, which, and I, from a British perspective, English perspective, have always seen France as being centralised. But I think it was really around the linguistic regions and the kind of the type of peoples. There's a map of the type of peoples in France. I don't know what it was, but it was relatively recently, and there was quite a lot of linguistic variation. I mean, obviously, the Basque area and the Catalani area, but also the sort of the northwest, the remainder of the Vikings that are still sort of being more Viking-y, and you guys on the borders. And sadly, I didn't actually watch it, so I know even less than I might have otherwise. But yes, there was this suggestion that this sort of strong centralisation into being La France and Francais as our language is much more recent than I certainly would have thought.
Yeah, it is. In a way, it dates back to the Third Republic and the way the education system was centralized and rolled out in the 19th century. But the reality is that over the past 150 years, France managed to crush and lose any kind of linguistic diversity. And with some friends, we try to maintain some kind of Alsatian dialect, but it's really hard because no one below 50 years old speaks it. And if you compare it to Switzerland, or even to an extent to Germany, like in Switzerland, from one valley to the next, you have different versions of Swiss German, but with globalization, everything tends to kind of harmonize. But even to these days, when you go to Zurich, you don't speak exactly the same kind of Swiss German as in Lucerne, or as in in Zermatt or in Basel. And in a way, France is so coercive on individual diversity. And it was like, if you allow me a tiny anecdote, but that says a lot. Like, after high school, the best schools happen to be in Paris. So, when you're 18, like many youngsters, I had to migrate over to Paris. And we all arrived there in Paris with our regional accents or whatever was left of it. And I can tell you that within 2 months, teachers would laugh at you if you had an accent from the south of France or the remnants of an Alsatian accent. And within 2 months, everyone was speaking standard French. And there's so much peer pressure around it.
Yes, that's been a huge thing in England as well. I mean, when I was young, before any sort of globalization, and for example, Margaret Thatcher in 1978 removing exchange controls so you could actually just go and get foreign currency was a huge deal. But before that, the vast majority of the country had never went abroad. And there were huge differences between the so-called ridings, the sub-counties within Yorkshire. That was a really big thing, and a massive difference between Yorkshire and Lancashire, and they were right adjacent. And in terms of languages, if you go to Cumbria, which is the Lake District in the northwest, there's still Cumbrian dialect and words which are of very different origin. But as you say, in terms of the centralisation, which reaches its reductio ad absurdum in terms of globalism, it ends up being one size fits all. Right, okay, so look, moving on from that to your career journey, as you say, you shuttled around geographically. Maybe you'd like to give the listeners a little bit of a background of where you're coming from, whether it's management consultancy or tech or banking, and what it was that sort of led you to the rather crazy, if romantic, decision to be a founder, to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, so my name is Louis Carbonnier. I'm 41 years old. I've got one daughter. I'm currently based in Paris, but I started my career in London back in 2005 in management consulting. Worked at a company called Oliver Wyman for 8 years, which is where I met my co-founder, Richard, who used to be my mentor back then. Then traveled a bit, worked from Australia for a couple of years. It was a fantastic experience to be able to travel across Asia for projects. And in 2014, I joined a company called Euler Hermes, which has since then rebranded as Allianz Trade. And they're a bit like the platypus of financial services because they're right between insurance and banking. They are the world leader in something called credit insurance, which is the insurance against unpaid invoices. And that's something very linked to B2B trade finance. And that's when I had the idea for what became later Hokodo. So I set up Hokodo in 2018 with two co-founders, Richard, who's English, whom I mentioned just before, and Sami, who happens to be Belgian. So, you can see that right from the start, we had this kind of multicultural angle to it. Strangely enough, Sami and I are both based in Paris, but the company is nonetheless headquartered in the UK. And I'm sure we'll come on to that, but there were, despite Brexit coming up, we could see it already looming in 2018. We thought it would be best to set up the company in London. And now we have about 100 employees from more than 20 different nationalities across London and Paris, with more than half in London, but a growing office in Paris.
Excellent. Well, we'll turn on to Hokodo a little bit later in the episode, and you can explain certainly to me and perhaps the listeners as well why you chose something that is apparently a Japanese name. Maybe it isn't, but it's certainly very easy to say in Japanese. But moving on to La Belle France and the centralisation, certainly post your great dear leader Napoleon back in the day. Let's just start with the history. As I always have to say, fintech is a silly word, but in the sense that it's currently meant, not computers in the 1960s did bank account statements, something like that. When do you believe that fintech as a thing really took off in France as such?
Yeah, so I would date it back to the early 2010s when there was a kind of tipping point. So, it's all a matter of definition, by the way, because as you said, we could go back to the 1960s, but I think certainly following the introduction of iPhone 2007, suddenly there was a switch to mobile and realization that many sectors would digitize in the industry. And it's around that point that back in management consulting, I started to get more and more assignments that were around, hey, so imagine a large bank suddenly asking us, hey, what should our digital strategy look like? And you could see the first, founders pioneering some new banks, some apps in the fintech space. So I think tech started earlier than that, in the 2000s, and there are some incumbents, and I shouldn't call them incumbents, but French scale-ups that with the first wave of founders that dates back to the first .com era. But for fintech itself, which is a bit more niche and a bit harder to disrupt because of all the regulation, I'd say it really started around 2010, 2012. That was probably the pivotal time. And many of the startups that have become unicorns in the fintech sector actually go back to the mid-2010s.
Okay, and so the context in which fintech is given birth in France is very much, of course, dependent upon the structure of financial services.
Yep.
Like us, even if you're a younger country, of course, you've had banks for quite a while, and they've got quite a stranglehold on the market, whereas in terms of episodes like that on Saudi Arabia, like that on China, if you go back, they didn't have such a strong banking sector for different reasons, and therefore the genesis and the direction of fintech is very different in those countries. As I mentioned earlier, the episode on Berlin, you will not fail to notice Germany as a whole, I was about to say, has some large, strong banks. These days, next to nobody has large and strong banks, large and weak banks with a bit of sort of clever accounting treatment on the stress test, I think, and that includes America. That's another story entirely. But there is a large incumbent sector, and I presume that in a relatively similar way, perhaps even to the UK, but fintech seemed to have taken off here a little bit more, that to an extent there were areas within, shall we say, financial services, which are much harder if you're going to found a fintech in France 10 years ago or 5 years ago or today, to actually squeeze your way in at the table because they've all got it, the banks have got it sewn up. I mean, how does that contextual environment appear to you being based in Paris?
So I think there's traditionally, France is one of the most conservative regulatory landscapes, which has played to the advantage of the French banks during the global financial crisis, where you could see that banks such as BNP Paribas or Crédit Agricole were incredibly resilient throughout that period. But on the other hand, you have something which is well known as the banking monopoly, which has been more of a handbrake on happiness when it comes to innovation. And it's only in the past 6 years, I would say, that incumbents have really started to welcome innovation and are now going with the flow rather than trying to resist it. So all the European regulation around payment has become fairly uniform. If you think of PSD1, PSD2, so sorry, I shouldn't talk in acronyms, but Payment Service Directives 1 and 2. And these typically France would transpose with a bit of delay, but eventually transpose into its own legislation. But then when it comes to lending itself, this isn't really harmonized in Europe. And for instance, there are areas such as lending to businesses in the UK, in the Netherlands, it's completely unregulated. Whereas in France, it's a highly regulated area, which makes innovation really, really costly. So it's no wonder that companies like Funding Circle, Market Finance have emerged in the UK, and you don't see that the equivalent in France.
Yes, this whole Eurosclerosis word, or long-term below quotes trend unquotes GNP growth in Europe, which is now spread to the UK, I see due to an excess of bindweed, due to an excess of regulation all over the place, due to an excess of control. And there's an interesting aspect which I wonder whether this affects the subconscious or the conscious minds of the authorities, which is if you go back to France, it was much racier in finance than Britain. You had this chap, I've forgotten when, I don't know, 1700 and something, John Law, who had Scottish guy, totally
rings a bell.
Fucked the currency and all sorts of things like that, and it was a catastrophe. And then you had your great revolution in favour of equality, fraternity, or diversity, equity, whatever, all those kind of abstracty words that you French people love, which was all wonderful until millions died and they introduced paper currency. And then, as we've touched on the podcast before, it was only Napoleon's reintroduction of the gold standard and the whole Napoleonic laws around finance that settled the things down. So do you think it's, going back to the longer history, do you think this fact that France was way too racy on currency and money and severely burnt its fingers to the extent of millions of people dying in the latter case, inter alia, as part of the revolution, that led it to become such a conservative country? Because although we think of France as being conservative in a sense, it wasn't always that way. Is it an overreaction, or is it just kind of central control, as it now is in the UK also, has got out of control?
I think it actually dates back even further than that. You're right in pointing to some sources around the revolution, because the revolution is the story of the bankruptcy of the French monarchy, and at the same time you had the bourgeoisie that was up and coming and thought they deserved a seat at the table, so that, the whole regime crumbled, and John Law and Necker were part of that general collapse of the French finances. But I think if you go back 500 years before, you have a kind of bifurcation in the European history between the Catholic regime and the Protestant psyche. And in the Catholic mind, there's some kind of contempt for money and lack of entrepreneurship, and the reluctance to take ownership of your own destiny, because there's a kind of general fate, which means that this plays out in so many different areas of society. And then another bifurcation, I'd say, is the kind of fork between common law and the Code Civil, so the kind of top-down body of legislation which Napoleon introduced, which was great at the beginning because it abolished all kinds of privileges and customs and things like that. because in the old days France had a common law as a monarchy, just like the UK. But as society develops, and as I'm sure you're aware, laws tend to pile up, and what was once a practical code that people could go by becomes a monster. So if you take French labor law, I think it's about 4,000 pages nowadays. If you compare it with I don't know how it works in the UK, but for instance in Switzerland, labor law is about 200 pages. And it's amazing, the amount of complexity and bureaucracy that it creates in day-to-day life. So, I remember in the early days of Hokodo, we were, an employee asked us how to compute their number of holidays. And with my co-founder, Sami, who's, PhD in physics and much smarter than I am, so a proper rocket scientist, we're like, oh my God, I don't know how to answer his question. Let's go back to the text of the law and we look at the code. And we look at the difference between jour ouvrable and jour ouvré, which is basically working day versus workable day. And we read the definition and we're like, Sami, I can't really understand it. I'm not sure. And he looks at me, he's like, no, I'm not sure either. And we do more and more research. And it turns out that our accountant himself had made a mistake. And you basically create a law which the entrepreneurs, the accountants, no one knows how to interpret. And you create that. I mean, the only people who benefit from it are, tax advisors, accountants, lawyers. And it becomes just impossible to do business, and you put a burden on top of your productive SME layer in society that is just unreasonable.
Yes,
so I think you have all those things. Sorry, it's a long rant.
No. I agree, and as listeners will know to their cost, I'm very good at ranting on this point. I mean, it seems to me at this stage that whatever used to be called the West, for the sake of argument, the continent and the former Anglosphere, the way that this is playing out is that, and you can see it from the GNP charts and the industrial production. If you look at industrial production, global share of Europe, continent and the UK, over the past few decades, it's been going down simply because of all this insane bindweed. And I also believe we're in a governance crisis within the West. And if we went back, for the sake of argument, 50 years, I could argue that we have the common law. We still have a relatively minarchist perspective over here. You can do what you like, and the government doesn't care about most of it. Whereas you guys, you've been told what you can do, a bit like the Americans, and they've written the Constitution down, but we don't really have a written one. We do have a written one, but it relies on good chaps. That there were distinct differences 50, 100 years ago, massively between the countries. But it doesn't really matter. America's got a bloody constitution, but the bloody negative elite just ignore it anyway, and as you say, the regulation piles up on the continent. Right, okay, so that's challenges for entrepreneurs all over the world. I suspect that were I to be doing, which I won't, this podcast in 10, 20, 30 years' time, I shall have to move to East Asia or something like that, where they're actually getting stuff done way faster. So, just briefly then, on the geographical distribution, because we started with geography and centralisation and everybody being turned into kind of Parisians if they want to get anywhere, as it were. And that's not just a Western thing. I was talking to a barman in Kota Kinabalu on Sabah in the autumn, and I was asking him what he wanted. So I want to go to Kuala Lumpur. Everybody wants to go, as a story of Dick Whittington. Back in the day here, that the streets of London are paved with gold. People always want to go to the capital where the action is, so that's nothing new. But in terms of fintech, is France like Britain, whereby you hear noises about fintech elsewhere, and that's nice, and we'd all like more of it, but actually in reality, the vast majority is in London, full stop. Is it the case that Paris is pretty much it for fintech, or is it 95% or 99% of fintech?
So it's very centralized in that respect. France is very much like the UK. Whereas, you could argue that in Germany you've got Berlin, but you've got Munich as well, Frankfurt to an extent when it comes to fintech. In France, it's still very, revolves around Paris. But there's been a reversal of that trend, I would say, over the past 3 years due to COVID. Lots of Parisians have realized that they could have a much better lifestyle living in a smaller city or in the southwest by the sea, and enjoy some nice benefits. And it's only a short train ride to go back to Paris, do your fundraise, and then go back to Bordeaux or to Brittany. So let's say all the VCs, all the banks headquarters and so on are still in Paris, and a lot of them, I think it's hard to avoid the occasional trip to Paris. This being said, there's a little bit of centrifugal movement to the other cities following COVID and the ability to do remote work, like to record this podcast. We didn't have to be in person. I could do it from Paris while you're in London, so that helps a lot, obviously.
Okay, so going back to the challenges and also the opportunities, two sides of the coin. You mentioned already the insane amount of law and regulation and codes, which even if it started off as a good idea, whatever it was 200 years ago, ends up growing and growing and growing, and it is due for a complete reformation perhaps at some point, even if it is by the whole bloody thing collapses in a heap and gets reborn somehow.
Which is how France works, by the way. There's always that saying that France does revolutions, whereas England does evolutions.
Yes. Well, I think one of the things that we English admire you French for is that you're very good at being revolting and protesting, and it just sort of warms the cockles of my heart to see your French farmers spreading manure all over the government. I wish we had that. And the problem over here, as you will have noticed, is that Britain was kind of fine when it was all sort of very British and very unwritten, and everybody just behaved in a certain way. But once you get, in particular, Parliament not actually behaving, not actually doing the right thing, then we've got a real problem here, because we are no good at revolting at all. So anyway, that's a separate point. But anyway, so a bit like in Berlin, there were, my simple takeaway, there were some huge strengths of being in Berlin. There's some really cool things about being in Berlin, but there's some awful challenges around having companies and fundraising, and oh my God, what a nightmare. And maybe the way to end up doing that is perhaps a bit like you've done in France, which is that there are some things you don't want to do in Berlin. Don't form a company, don't raise the money. But actually there's lots of other things that you want to do in Berlin. So maybe one splits in this modern way, enabled by technology, of course, as you say. Maybe one splits, I don't know, legal formation and, I don't know, labour laws or something, and sticks it over here. And maybe one sticks the devs over there and the marketing people over here and this kind of thing. So maybe you just let the listeners know from your perspective of not just having travelled around a bit, but now being in Paris. What do you see the principal opportunities and good news of being a fintech in Paris tomorrow, if somebody wants to form a fintech in Paris? And then equally, as you say, what are the challenges and what are the bits that, as it were, you'd be better off exporting if you can out of France into somewhere else?
Yeah, so there's no denying that, the labor law, the tax environment and so on, all that stuff is probably a bit more complex in France than it is in the UK or the US. But I'd say it's manageable. Having worked in Germany as well, in many respects, I think there's been a lot of adoption of, all the large French companies have moved to digitized processes, e-signatures. I recently had to renew my passport and ID card, and it was way more streamlined than it was 10 years ago, because you have to renew these docs every 10 years. So there's been a lot of changes there. And I'd say that the main advantage is that, being based in France gives you access to a pretty deep market that is, in certain respects, quite advanced. So, for us, targeting a lot of e-commerce marketplaces, we've been very surprised to see that we found bigger traction in France than in the UK, and by default we were, our brain was hardwired in, England has faster adoption rates of all the new trends and so on. Well, actually, most of the large marketplaces are more based in France or in Germany than they are in the UK. Or when it comes to deep tech, there's a vibrant sector ecosystem in France, and I think some talent pools are inherited from local traditions. So if you take our world of trade finance, BNP is one of the three leaders globally with Citi and HSBC. Or in the world of trade credit, in trade credit insurance, 2 out of the 3 global leaders are based in Europe with Allianz Trade, and in France with Allianz Trade and Coface. So that has created pockets of talent pools in those verticals that are extremely dynamic and create a very vibrant payments ecosystem, for instance, in France, with companies like Mango Pay, Lemonway, Limonetic, who take the legacy of companies like Ingenico, Worldline, or the chip card was invented by a French guy back in the days. So there are pockets like this where the French market is actually quite attractive and less contested than the UK. Because of the language barrier, many of the US VCs will build their bridgehead in London, and London is much more like a Shark Tank, where every deal is contested by many bidders, whereas France would offer quite a lot of opportunity, but because of this language barrier, it would be far less contested than London.
Excellent. Well, let's just expand on this ecosystem point. I mentioned the historical and geographical surround to the rising of fintech in France. What about the ecosystem where Saudi Arabia sticks in my mind as the government decided what was going to happen and made it happen, and it's got targets for 150 fintechs in 5 years, or whatever it is, a very centralised thing. The UK, where nobody even knew what Zupa was in 2005 when it formed, and nobody really cared for a while, and then a few others formed, and then when it started doing well, about 2015 onwards, the government goes, oh wow, there's some success here, let's go and kiss babies, let's go and steal jam, let's go and plant other people's flags, etc., and then gets involved with its initiatives after the event. How would you summarise the overall ecosystem in terms of government involvement, government support, government creation of the right environment, funding in terms of VCs, talent pool, all those sort of matters, which are really the bread and butter of a day-to-day entrepreneur's life, which either make life easier or more difficult?
That's a very tough question, Mike.
Good. It's a very long question as well. Just pick whatever bits you like.
In the UK, it strikes me that the government has made some, created some lighter processes for innovation. If you think of like the regulatory sandbox, or pushing against open banking and making it even more encompassing than PSD2, whereas the French government tends to be more conservative and deploy PSD2 as slowly as possible. So, whereas the French government, I'd say, is more proactive in terms of granting subsidies. So, the labor costs are pretty high, but if you are a jeune entreprise innovante, so young, innovative company, you get a tax break. You get a lot of tax credits on R&D as well. So it's that kind of stuff that the government really pushes. But in general, there's a lot to be said for and against the Macron presidency, I'm sure, but overall it's been relatively pro-business. And I think that has created a catch-up effect. You see a lot of foreign direct investments into France. The amount of VC money and PE money going into France has massively increased over the past years. So there's been a general trend of catching up, but a lot of it off the back of subsidies, tax breaks. There's a government called BPI, a government body that invests actually in startups. So about one funding round out of 5 has support from BPI.
Wow.
Which is a kind of almost socialist approach to fundraising.
Yes, it reminds me of the formation of the East India companies in the UK, the English East India Company. There was a bunch of merchants who had to petition for Yonks, the Queen, to get permission. Oh yeah, go on then, eventually she said. And they went and gone on with it. And whereas in France, whichever king it was at the time, said, we're going to have one of these and you're all going to invest. And none of the barons invested. He loses a lot of his money, the central versus spread out. So coming back to the present day, I mean, one of the points which is very relevant, and the world's in an increasingly flat playing field, is that the world of talent. People say there's a lot of talent in London, yes, but then the price is bid up more and they can't afford to live anywhere, and London's collapsing, and minor matters like that. What's the environment like for getting fintech talent of all sorts in Paris? And then how do you see the future of fintech in Paris? And then we'll move on to Hokodo.
So I don't know if it's bias or a kind of legacy, but traditionally France has produced a lot of engineers. And there's a lot of focus on maths and physics throughout your education. This is rather good for tech, because that creates a big talent pool with lots of gifted engineers, very, very strong developers, and that creates like some tailwinds for French startups or foreign startups hiring from France. And in the digital era, that war for talent is really, really hard, and we experience it with our London office every day. And in France, but I'm sure in other European countries, you can find those local cities outside of the capital where you find some very decent engineers at and the value for money that you get from those people who don't want to live in Paris, don't want to live in London, is actually very, very strong. And this is only further supported by the ability to work remotely. Going forward, I would only expect this trend to continue. As a startup, you can differentiate from the large companies by offering remote or hybrid work. And that really changes the nature of the relationship. And I think it's actually easier these days for a startup to attract top talent in France than it would be for a large company, because you're able to offer the best tools, a relatively free environment to develop whatever you want, and hybrid working conditions, and that creates a package that's unbeatable compared with what a more traditional bank would offer.
Excellent. Well, one thing that occurs to me that actually we haven't mentioned on the podcast before, talking of Anglo-French linguistics, is that, as you are well aware, we call a computer because it is a computer. But actually that's an interesting emphasis, because it's an emphasis on computation. I don't think I do much computation on my computer. You guys call it a coordinateur, and certainly if you're an entrepreneur, you're coordinatoring quite a lot. And I guess I coordinate my emails and my documents and these kind of things. So your word is probably better these days. But actually then it occurs to me that neither the French nor the English call a computer a communicateur, something that communicates, because actually a lot of what we use computers or phones or tablets for these days is communicating information, is having information flowing around the world. And maybe that something in the naming tends to send people down one direction. I think the computation bit is coming back with all this sort of AI and chat GPT and automatic transcription, automatic translation. The computer actually has to sort of scratch its head and do quite a few calculations to make that work. But most of us have this sort of massive thing sitting under our desk and just use it for, I don't know, Skype or email or something
Facebook.
like that. So before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all you listeners out there, my brand partners for the podcast. Smart is transforming pensions and retirement worldwide. The leading edge retirement tech platform propelled them success in the UK. Now they're operating on 4 continents and working with partners like Zurich and JP Morgan. Find out more at www.smart.co. The enlistedboard.com, your guide to entrepreneurial governance and how you can start making your board an engine of growth today. So, Louis, you've been a very kind guest in terms of sticking to the main course, and we all understand a little bit more about finteching in France than we did, I'm sure, half an hour or so ago. So maybe you would be kind enough now to tell the listeners about Hokodo? Is it a Japanese name, and if so, why? Which is perhaps the more trivial thing, but perhaps more importantly from a commercial perspective, what it is that you guys do, which of the listeners should be checking you out right away if what you do is relevant for them, and what your plans are for the future, and minor matters like what do you need more of tomorrow to make you even bigger and better than you are today.
Yeah, so Hokodo is a pan-European scale-up that helps merchants and marketplaces sell more by offering instant payment terms to their customers. So think of it as a solution that makes B2B payments simple. And that's actually the link to the Japanese-sounding name Hokodo, because we wanted something that would simplify a process that's very complex today, the process of doing a transaction B2B, and make it sound much more zen than it currently is, because under the final B2B transaction, you have several stages like credit checks, collections, insurance, financing, and all that stuff, which we actually bundle in one platform that allows merchants to essentially sell more by offering better payment terms than they used to. So think a bit of it like a kind of Klarna of B2B. And for the rugby fans out there, Hoko happens to mean trade in Maori. So that's the other wink in the name. And it's fascinating what we're going through at the moment, because B2B trade is shifting massively. It's a fascinating industry. It's thrice as large as B2C, and it's migrating online. About 10% of B2B trade is currently being done online. But what happened in B2C, where you had an entire industry that emerged around B2C commerce, think of it like PayPal, Stripe, Shopify, all those companies that are the scaffolding that facilitates B2C trade online, needs to be reinvented in B2B. And Hokodo is at the cutting edge of that shift of B2B towards e-commerce. And we provide the best payment systems for companies that want to grow and expand their presence online.
Excellent. And along with clients, which all businesses always want more of, what do you need more of tomorrow than today to make you bigger and better?
So we're expanding internationally because if you think of a large merchant in the UK, as soon as a company turns over more than 20-30 million pounds, they start exporting. And that means that they start exporting to France, Germany, the US, you name it. So for us, it's really crucial to support our clients in their growth and be able to help them with our payments in France, in Germany, and wherever. So we're currently present in the UK, in France, Benelux, Germany, Spain, and Italy. But in our roadmap for 2024, we want to be able to cover all of Europe. We're also forging a partnership with a US company called Balance to be able to support European companies that want to export in the US. So with covering the US and Europe, we'll be able by the end of 2024 to offer a platform that covers most of the needs of European companies.
Excellent. Well, I thank you very much for that, Louis, on my behalf and on behalf of the listeners, for an excellent tour de force et tour d'horizon about fintech in France. And also, just at a sort of more personal level, you've reminded me that I've been meaning to go to Alsace for decades because it's such a beautiful area, some beautiful towns, along with the beautiful wine and the beautiful...
Good wines as well.
Very good wines, yes. So I must actually bring it nearer the top of my to-do list than it has been for quite some time. So I wish you and Hokodo every success in the future.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you're in need of a non-executive or advisory director with deep expertise, experience and contacts in the worlds of both traditional FS and fintech, or unique insight into how to make your board an engine of growth today, contact me at mike@mikeballiman.com. If you just need one-off advice in these areas, via clarity.fm/mikeballiman.
We could sit and bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.